what if the greatest love story ever written isn't actually a love story at all? Emily Brontë's tremendous story of hate. That line appeared in the very first movie poster for Wuthering Heights, a silent movie from 1920 that has since been lost to time. Not a sweeping romance, not an immortal love story, a story of hate. The people who first put it on screen understood something that a century of romanticization has almost entirely erased. And now in 2026, Emerald Fennell, the director of Promising Young Woman and the writer of Saltburn, has made her own version. Warner Brothers won the rights in a bidding war reportedly topped by a $150 million Netflix offer. Margot, Robbie, and Jacob Elordi are starring. Charli XCX wrote the soundtrack. The reviews range from "I sobbed for an hour" to 50 Shades of Wuthering Heights. The internet is divided. But here's the thing. To understand why this film exists, why it provokes the reaction it does, and whether any of the outrage is warranted, we need to go back, way back, to a 30-year-old woman in Yorkshire who had never published anything before, writing the only novel she would ever complete. Emily Brontë was born in 1818 in Thornton, West Yorkshire, and spent almost her entire short life within sight of the moors she would write about. She was the fifth of 6 children born to Patrick Brontë, an Irish Anglican clergyman, and her sister Charlotte would go on to write Jane Eyre. Her brother Branwell, a talented but troubled artist and poet, would descend into alcoholism and opium addiction before dying at 31. A figure some scholars believe partly inspired the characters of Hindley Earnshaw. Emily herself was famously private, almost pathologically so. She declined social engagement, preferred animals to people, and turned down every opportunity to capitalize on her literary fame after publication. When Wuthering Heights was published in December 1847 under the male name Alice Bell, she had less than a year to live. She died of tuberculosis in December 1848, aged 30, having never written a second novel. That single novel, written in nearly total isolation on the Yorkshire moors, published under a false name, criticized on the first publication as wild, confused, and improbable, would go on to be adapted for stage, screen, ballet, opera, graphic novel, Bollywood musical, and a caboose song that became one of the most iconic pop recordings of the 20th century. It is, by any measure, one of the most persistent stories in the English language. Ask most people to describe Wuthering Heights, and they will tell you it's a doomed romance between Heathcliff and Catherine on the moors of Yorkshire. Star-crossed, passionate, gothic, and that description is not wrong, it's just dramatically incomplete. Wuthering Heights is a multi-generational saga between 1771 and 1802. It is told through the accounts of 2 unreliable narrators, a fussy, pompous tenant named Lockwood and the family housekeeper Nellie Dean, which means everything we know about the events is filtered through perspectives that are kinda biased, self-serving, and frequently wrong. The story proper takes place across 2 overlapping generations, the first ending in tragedy, the second in a kind of darkly ambiguous redemption. Catherine Earnshaw does not die at the end of the novel, she dies halfway through, at 18, in childbirth, and Heathcliff spends the remaining half destroying everyone she left behind. This is the half the movie's cut. Every adaptation, almost without exception, ends or dramatically de-emphasizes the second generation, the story of young Cathy, Catherine's daughter, Linton Heathcliff, Heathcliff's sickly son, and Hareton Earnshaw, the son of Hindley, whom Heathcliff has reduced to a literate servant out of spite. The problem with their mission is profound. Remove the second generation and you can plausibly read Heathcliff as a tragic romantic hero. Include it and you cannot. He manipulates a dying child into marriage to secure property. He humiliates and brutalizes an innocent boy for 20 years to punish his father. He is the villain, except the book refuses the easy verdict too. This is what makes Wuthering Heights genuinely difficult to adapt. It asks you to hold contempt and sympathy for the same man simultaneously across events that span 30 years. Most filmmakers resolve that tension by removing one half of the equation entirely. Then there is a question of who Heathcliff actually is. Brontë describes him as having the countenance of a dark-skinned gypsy in aspect, with black eyes, and skin repeatedly compared to that of a Lascar, a South Asian sailor. He is brought to England as a young child by Mr. Ershaw, who found him in Liverpool, then one of the most racially diverse port cities in Britain, heavily connected to the slave trade. His origins are never explained. He has no surname. He has no past. The racial ambiguity of Heathcliff is not accidental, it's structural. His position as permanent outsider, the violence with which he is treated and the violence he enacts in return, the way the other characters speak about him as something less than fully human, all of this maps directly onto the racial dynamics of 19th century Britain. Whether Brontë consciously intended this or not, scholars have been making this argument for decades, and it is part of what makes every casting decision for the role genuinely controversial. The silent 90-20 film is gone. What we have instead are traces, a poster, a cast slide, a running time, and that extraordinary tagline. It is in a way the perfect ghost. The story of Wuthering Heights starts with the lost film advertising itself as a story of hate, and then disappears entirely, leaving subsequent filmmakers to decide which story they were actually telling. This is the film that defied the popular understanding of the story for most of the 20th century. Laurence Olivier as Heathcliff, brooding and electrifying. Merle Oberon as Cathy, luminous and tragic. The moors sweeping and atmospheric, except the moors were actually Thousand Oaks, California. The film covered only the first 16 of novel's 34 chapters. It ends not with the multi-generational aftermath, but with the death of Cathy and a supernatural reunion. Samuel Goldwyn, the producer, added that reunion against William Wyler's explicit wishes. Wyler hated it. He felt it sentimentalized the story that was supposed to be unsentimental. Goldwyn responded by saying, "I made Wuthering Heights. Wyler only directed it." The film was nominated for 8 Academy Awards and won the New York Film Critic Award for the Best Film. It did not win Best Picture. That went to The Gone with the Wind. It is by many measures the most culturally influential adaptation and also the most responsible for reducing the novel to a conventional love story. Timothy Dalton, later the most underrated James Bond, brings genuine psychosexual intensity to the role. This version is darker than Wyler's in almost every aspect, ending with Hindley fatally shooting Heathcliff and the lover's ghost walking the moors together. Dalton's Heathcliff is not merely passionate, he is genuinely threatening. It is a better film than it is remembered as being. This is not a film, but it cannot be omitted from any honest history of the story's cultural life. Kate Bush was 19 years old when she wrote and recorded the song that would become her debut single. It went to #1 in the UK and stayed there for 4 weeks. It is arguably the most emotionally influential version of the story, the one that formed the romantic mythology of Wuthering Heights for an entire generation who had not yet read the novel. The song is sung from Cathy's perspective, pleading with Heathcliff to let her in. It takes exactly the reading of the story that 1939 film established and amplifies it to operatic pop perfection. If you have the word Wuthering Heights in your head and you feel something romantic, there is a good chance Kate Bush put it in there. The most ambitious attempt, on paper, at covering the full novel. Both Fiennes and Benage play dual roles, appearing as both their first-generation characters and their second-generation counterparts. In practice, the film is broadly considered inert, despite the extraordinary talent involved. Fiennes, fresh off Schindler's List, filmed the following year but released first in critical memory, is compelling enough. But the film struggles with the same structural problem every adaptation faces. He cannot decide whether to be a love story or a revenge narrative, and ends up being neither quite convincingly. This is the most critically serious adaptation since Wyler's, and the most formally radical. Andrea Arnold shot it handheld, with natural light, minimal dialogue, and long stretches of near silence. The landscape, actually shot on location in Yorkshire, is not picturesque. It is oppressive, relentless, and cold. Most significantly, this is the first major film adaptation to cast a black actor as Heathcliff. James Hawson, a young actor with no prior film credits, was cast in the role. The choice was deliberate. Arnold has spoken about wanting to represent Heathcliff's racial otherness as something visible and legible rather than merely implied, and the result is a film in which the violence enacted against Heathcliff and by Heathcliff carries a weight that previous white cast versions cannot access. It remains the most artistically committed adaptation of the novel. It is also the least watched. No survey of Wuthering Heights adaptations is complete without acknowledging the full scope of cultural appropriation the story has endured. There was a 1958 television version with Richard Burton as Heathcliff, filmed live, in which Burton apparently terrified his co-stars. There was a 2003 MTV adaptation set in California high school with rock music and ATV chases. There was Wuthering High School 2015, relocated to Malibu. There was a Bollywood musical that transposed the story to rural India, a Japanese period drama set during the samurai era, a French film, a Spanish film, a graphic novel, an opera, a ballet. What all of this adaptation prove is something important. No story gets retold this compulsively unless it touches something elemental. The setting changes, the costumes change, the language changes, but the central wound remains. Two people who cannot live together and cannot live apart, and everything they destroy in the process. When Emerald Fennell announced in July 2024 that she would write and direct a new adaptation of Wuthering Heights, the announcement arrived with a set of credentials that made it immediately significant. Fennell's debut feature, Promising Young Woman, won her the Academy Award for the Best Original Screenplay. Her follow-up, Saltburn, was a divisive but commercially successful psychological thriller that established her as one of the most distinctive visual stylists working in British cinema. Margot Robbie was attached as both lead actress and producer through her company Lucky Champ Entertainment, the same company that produced both of Fennell's previous films. Jacob Elordi, who starred in Saltburn, was cast as Heathcliff. The film is, in a meaningful sense, a reunion. Three collaborators who have spent years developing a shared cinematic language, now applying it to the most difficult literary adaptation in the English language. The scale of industry interest in this project was extraordinary. When the package went out, Fennell directing, Robbie and Elordi starring, a Fennell written script, studios began competing for distribution rights in manner not seen for a literary adaptation in years. Netflix offered $100 million for streaming rights. Warner Brothers, understanding that Robbie and Fennell would refuse a streaming-only release, won the bidding not with the highest number, but with the right terms. $80 million, a wide theatrical release, and a major marketing campaign. This condition matters. Fennell and Robbie insisted on theatrical. They were not making a prestige streaming event, they were making a film. The decision to cast Jacob Elordi, white, Australian, 6'5", previously best known for Euphoria and Saltburn, as Heathcliff was immediately controversial, particularly in the light of Andrea Arnold's 2011 decision to cast a black actor in the same role. Fennell addressed the criticism directly in September 2025, stating that Elordi looked exactly like the illustration of Heathcliff in the first edition of the book she has read as a child. This is a defensible artistic position. This is also a position that forecloses a particular interpretive possibility, the one Arnold has so deliberately opened. Where Arnold's casting made Heathcliff racial otherness concrete and contemporary, Fennell's returns is to abstraction. Whether that is a loss or a legitimate artistic choice is one of the film's most substantive debates. Elordi himself has spoken about nearly not taking the role. He had been contemplating a break from acting. The relentless cycle of blockbusters and franchise work had left him creatively depleted. Fennell offered him Heathcliff without an audition. He said yes. Unlike the 1939 adaptation's California Substitute, Fennell's film was shot partly on location in the Yorkshire Dales. Principal photography ran from late January to early April 2025 in the depth of northern English winter. The choice to use 35mm VistaVision cameras, a widescreen format that was popular in the 1950s and 60s but has since largely fallen out of use, gives the film a particular visual texture: wide, immersive, slightly grainy, with a depth of field that makes the landscape feel simultaneously vast and suffocating. Interior sequences were filmed at Sky Studios Elstree, one of the UK's largest studio facilities, which opened in 2022. Filming in a Yorkshire winter during the coldest month of 2025 had predictable consequences. Elordi has spoken in interviews about extended days and freezing conditions, leaving him out of sorts and battling persistent low moods throughout the shoot. He also sustained second-degree burns in an on-set accident leaning against a hot steam shower fixture between takes. These details are minor in themselves, but speak to the physical commitment the production demanded. This was not a comfortable or controlled shoot. It was cold and difficult and occasionally dangerous, and that experience appears to have left its marks on the performances. Perhaps the most surprising creative choice in the entire production was the commissioning of Charli XCX to create an original album of songs for the film. The lead single, House, featuring Welsh musician and Velvet Underground co-founder John Cale, was released in November 2025 to considerable critical attention. The pairing makes a certain perverse sense. Charli XCX's hyperpop aesthetic, maximalist, emotionally overwhelming, concerned with obsession and desire and the collapse of the self, maps onto the emotional logic of Wuthering Heights in a way that most conventional score choices would not. It is also a deliberate provocation, a signal that the film is not trying to be a faithful Victorian period piece. It's a contemporary film set in a historical world, and its sound will make that position impossible to miss. The film is officially titled Wuthering Heights, in quotation marks. When asked about this, Fennell was explicit. You cannot adapt a book as dense and complicated and difficult as Wuthering Heights. What she is making, she said, is a version of it. The quotation marks around the title are a formal acknowledgement that is an interpretation, a perspective, a reading, not a novel itself. This is more intellectually honest than most adaptations manage, and it somewhat preempts the inevitable criticism that the film gets things wrong. It has announced in the title card that it is making no claim to definitiveness. The 2026 film currently holds a 63% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes from 230 critics' reviews. The critical consensus reads, liberally adapting Emily Brontë's classic story with heavy dose of carnality and chic stylization, Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights might not be the stuff of high literature, but it is a visually vibrant pleasure. The IMDb score sits at 6.3 out of 10. Audience reviews range from tearful endorsement to open mockery. 63% is not a triumph, but it's not a failure. It is the score of a film that divides people sharply, along lines that are probably less about filmmaking and more about what each viewer wanted the film to be. Every adaptation of Wuthering Heights romanticizes it. This is a trap every filmmaker falls into, because the most legible version of the story, the one audiences already know, the one Kate Bush encoded in a pop consciousness in 1978, is the romantic one. Fennell does not romanticize, she sexualizes. These are different moves, and the distinction matters enormously. A romanticized Wuthering Heights suggests that the love between Heathcliff and Catherine is transcendent, that it elevates them above ordinary human limitation, that its tragedy is the tragedy of a world too small for a feeling so large. This is the 1939 version. It is beautiful and fundamentally dishonest. A sexualized Wuthering Heights suggests that what drives these people is desire, physical, consuming, irrational, destructive desire, not love in the ennobling sense, but want in the devouring one. This is far more consistent with what the novel actually depicts. Heathcliff does not pine romantically for Catherine Ghost for 20 years while remaining otherwise virtuous. He systematically destroys every person connected to her. This is not the behavior of a man in love, it is the behavior of a man consumed. The question is not whether Fennell's film is faithful to the book, it is whether it's honest about the book's darkness in a way its predecessors refused to be. Like every adaptation before it, the 2026 film substantially condenses and largely omits the second generation of the story. Young Cathy, Linton Heathcliff, Hareton Earnshaw, the characters through whom Brontë actually resolves her narrative, they're present but marginal. This is frustrating, and it is a genuine artistic failure, but it is a failure worth contextualizing. Wuthering Heights in its complete form is an extraordinarily difficult structure to adapt in a 2-hour film. The second generation requires introducing new characters, establishing new relationships, and maintaining audience investment in people who are not the stars they came to see. Almost no filmmaker has managed it. Arnold came closest in 2011, but her film also runs to nearly 2 hours and still compresses the material significantly. The consequence of this recurrent omission is not just structural, it's moral. If you end the story with the death of Cathy and Heathcliff's grief, you have a tragedy. If you show what Heathcliff does next, you have something more complicated and considerably less comfortable. Fennell's film, like Wyler's, chooses tragedy over complication. But there are things that the film does right. The landscapes are extraordinary. Shooting in actual Yorkshire in actual winter, Fennell achieves something that the California-shot 1939 film cannot: a sense of the moors as genuinely hostile, as a landscape that does not accommodate human desire but confronts it. The cold is in the film, you feel it. Elordi's performance is better than the disclosure around the casting controversy allowed most critics to engage with fairly. He plays Heathcliff as something between grief and rage, with a physical quality. He towers over every scene that makes his menace legible without making him a cartoon villain. Robbie is luminous and unsettling in equal measure, a Cathy who is not merely tragic but complicit in her own catastrophe, which is far closer to the novel's characterization that most adaptations manage. The visual language of the film, the 35mm texture, the wide VistaVision frames, the long, slow, handheld moves through darkness, is distinctive and confident. Fennell is not pretending to have made the definitive adaptation. She has made a striking, deeply personal version, and the quotation marks in the title make that honesty formal. In the history of English literature, very few novels have generated the volume and variety of adaptation that Wuthering Heights has. Hamlet, perhaps, Pride and Prejudice, but Wuthering Heights has something those texts lack. It is genuinely unresolved. It refuses to be finished. Every adaptation is an argument about what the story means. The 1939 film argues it is a love story. The 2011 film argues it is a story about race and violence. Fennell's film argues it is a story about physical obsession. The Bollywood musical argues it is a story about class and family honor. The MTV teen comedy argues it is about social hierarchy in high school. All of these readings are defensible. None of them is complete. That is the engine of endless return. A story that cannot be definitively interpreted will always call for another interpretation. Emily Brontë died at 30, having written exactly one novel. It is still driving people mad, nearly 180 years later. If you want the definitive romantic version, the one that feels like the story most people think they know, watch the 1939 Wyler film. Olivier is extraordinary, and the production is genuinely beautiful, even if the moors are in California. If you want the most formally serious and artistically ambitious adaptation, watch the 2011 Andrea Arnold. It is cold and slow and not for every mood, but it is the most honest film about what the novel actually contains. If you want spectacle, visual confidence, and the willingness to be provocative, if you want a filmmaker making a genuine, artistic statement rather than a faithful costume drama, watch Fennell's 2026 film. Bring your disagreements. They are part of the experience. And if you want the most emotionally resonant version of the central myth, the one that has probably done more than any film to shape how people feel about this story before they ever read the word of the novel, listen to Kate Bush. 19 years old, 4 minutes and 23 seconds, still the definitive Wuthering Heights. So, love story or story of hate? Let's go back to the beginning. That 1920 poster, Emily Brontë's tremendous story of hate. And then a century of films, songs, musical, and adaptations working to transform it into something warmer and more comfortable. The honest answer is, it is both. And this is the point. It is a story about how love and hate are not opposites, but different temperatures of the same feeling. Heathcliff does not stop loving Catherine. He takes his love and turns it outward like a weapon, and uses it to destroy everything she ever touched. This is not a love story. This is not a hate story. It is a story about what happens when desire has nowhere to go, when the person who made you feel alive is gone, and you are still here with all that feeling and no direction left to point it. Emerald Fennell put quotation marks around the title. She was telling us, this is my reading. Every filmmaker who comes after her will have their own. Emily Brontë died at 30, having written exactly one novel. It is still driving people mad, nearly 180 years later. That might be the most Heathcliff thing imaginable. Watch only good movies, those which allow you to feel and question your feelings.
Kiss me again.